The first time they heard the cries, they thought it was the wind. By the time they opened the floor, it was already too late. Do not speak these words lightly. You're not here for entertainment. You're here because something inside you, some distant, buried instinct knows the world is not what it seems. This isn't history. This is the exhumation of truth. And what I'm about to show you, no institution ever wanted revealed. In the forgotten wilds of Colonial Virginia, a place untouched by time and ruled by whispers, the Sullivan family arrived like a shadow on the land. The year was 1634. Colonies were still dripping in blood, witch trials whispered from Puritan lips, and men built empires on land soaked with stolen breath. This was not America, it was something far older, wearing America's skin. The Sullivans did not arrive with the other settlers. No ship record, no town registry, no land deed anyone could trace. But by the winter solstice of that year, they were there. A house appeared at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, 3 miles beyond where any sane settler would build. The foundation stone, ancient, not quarried locally. The cellar dug deep, too deep, reinforced with iron bars and mortar soaked in blood. Rumors. A structure not designed for shelter, but for containment. Locals claimed they came from Ireland, though their dialect was strange, fractured like it had been preserved in ice for centuries. The father, Ezra, spoke rarely. The mother, Constance, always spoke in rhyme. Her voice was like silk soaked in honey, but her eyes never blinked long enough to seem human. And with them came the children. But here's the thing. Not one soul ever saw them arrive. They just appeared. Different faces, different sizes, different skin. No family resemblance, no laughter, no joy. Just the sound of metal dragging against stone, heard faintly when the wind blew just right across the field. The story begins not with a crime, but with a question, one so dangerous it was erased from the colonial records, scrubbed from church logs, and burned from the ledgers of Henrico County. Why were 57 children chained beneath the Sullivan farmhouse? And why did they all call the same woman mother, even when she wasn't the one who brought them there? Understand this, truth, real truth, is never clean. It doesn't come wrapped in parchment and sealed with wax. It's buried, hidden, guarded by those who built entire systems to ensure no one ever finds it. But once you hear it, once it seeps into your bones, you can't unhear it. This is your descent, and descent is the right word, because the basement they found wasn't just a prison, it was a temple. And it didn't begin in Virginia. It began long before the colonies were born, before the church, before the empire, before even the language to describe it. It began with something older than law, older than light. The land where the Sullivan home stood was already feared by the indigenous tribes who lived in the region. The Powhatan people refused to hunt. There they marked it on their sacred hides with a single symbol, a spiral of thorns. Do not go, they said. That place remembers. But the English settlers, drunk on conquest and blind to anything they couldn't measure with a scale or dominate with a sword, ignored the warnings. They built anyway. But only one family stayed. The Sullivans. There are fragments, lost letters, half-burned diary entries, colonial reports locked away in private collections that hint at what the Sullivans were really doing. And it wasn't farming. There are no crop records, no livestock purchases. But there are cargo manifests from the port at Jamestown, listing unaccompanied minors brought in under the church's orphan resettlement program, a program that, on paper, only ran for 5 years, yet children kept disappearing for decades. Those 57 children in the basement, some were listed as dead, some never had names at all. All of them were broken in some way by grief, poverty, or power. They were the discarded, and the Sullivan family was the collector. We speak often of evil like it's a moral failing, a character defect. But what if evil, real evil, isn't a flaw in the system, but the system itself? What if this wasn't a mistake? What if this was a blueprint? Constance Sullivan's mother was no lunatic. She was an architect of control. The chains weren't just physical, they were psychological, ritualistic, carved with markings that don't match any known language, but do match etchings found in Bronze Age burial tombs in Western Ireland. Marks associated with something called cloaked, black veil, pre-Christian goddess, a demon, a force of anti-motherhood we don't know, because every culture that tried to name it was erased, not defeated, erased, like the children, like the Sullivans. Ask yourself, how does a woman enslave 57 children, in full view of a town, without a single person speaking out? Here's how. You create the illusion of virtue so strong, so complete, but any cry for help sounds like madness. Constance volunteered at the local chapel. She hosted sewing circles. She made preserves for the orphans. She spoke about sin and redemption. She wept during sermons. And when neighbors asked about the strange noises, she would simply say, "They're healing." Healing is loud. Every system in power, church, school, town council trusted her. And why? Because she gave them a role to play. She made them feel like saviors, like shepherds of a righteous order, all while using their blind faith to feed something unspeakable. And that's the sickness at the heart of this. The Sullivan case isn't about one woman, one house, one horror. It's about what happens when entire communities willingly blind themselves, because truth is more terrifying than myth. That basement wasn't just a prison, it was a mirror. And when the sheriff finally opened the doors in 1634, when he saw those children, pale and shivering in the dark, whispering in a language no one had taught them, he ran. He never filed a report. He never told the town. He left Virginia 3 days later and was never heard from again. The house burned that winter, but the land remains. And every 50 years, there's a fire in Black Hollow Forest. No cause, no survivors. Because some truths are not lost, they're waiting. Now, so are you. You've taken the first step. Most won't. Most will scroll past and return to comfort, unaware that comfort is often constructed atop centuries of bone. But you didn't scroll, you stayed, and now it deepens. Let's follow the blood trail, shall we? In 1634, Virginia was not just a colony, it was a crucible. Land was stolen, souls were crushed, and the only God that mattered was the one who sanctioned conquest. It was here, under the rigid hand of English colonial rule and the ever-watchful eye of the Church of England, that Constance Sullivan made her alliances. But don't be fooled, her rituals didn't begin in the basement, they began at the altar. See, the local chapel in Henrico County was not much to look at. Rough timber walls, a crude cross, and sermons that beat the drum of obedience louder than love. But hidden in its records rare pages, buried in diocesan archives in London and only uncovered in the 1970s, are the notes of Reverend Nathaniel Paris, the second man assigned to the chapel in Millbrook, his journal torn, mold-stained, marked with Latin phrases that historians still argue over, contains one entry that has never been explained. She brings the children to be blessed, but they do not blink. They do not breathe as others. They wait, as if listening to something older than the Psalms. Paris would be found dead 3 weeks later, hanging behind the pulpit with his eyes removed and a child's wooden toy clenched in his hand. The official ruling, suicide, but there was no investigation. Why? Because the church was afraid. They knew something. Not everything, but enough to stay silent. Constance Sullivan was not unknown to them. Her family, the Moira line from Donegal Island, had been watched by inquisitors since the late 1500s. Her great-grandmother Eibhlin Moira was burned at the stake in Limerick for performing blood rites during Easter Mass. Her last words, "We are not the sheep, we are the altar." The church thought they had ended the line. They were wrong. Constance wasn't a witch, not in the fairy tale sense. She was worse. She understood that the church had long used the veil of virtue to hide rituals far darker than anything she could invent. So, she infiltrated, attended Mass, donated coin, prayed in public, and in private. She performed baptisms in reverse. One survivor only identified in records as E, and institutionalized until 1707 claimed that, at the Sullivan property, children were not baptized into the body of Christ, but into forgetting. The rite was simple: blood from the tongue, bone ash in the eyes, and a phrase whispered by Constance: "You were never born, you were never wanted, you are mine." And it worked. The children stopped speaking their native tongues. They forgot their parents' names. They accepted the name Mother as a gospel truth. This is psychological warfare, not as experiment, but as weapon, and Constance wasn't the first to wield it. She was just the first to do it under the protection of the church. Let me explain something uncomfortable. In every system of organized power, there's a threshold, a place where faith meets function, and function becomes manipulation. When Constance provided the church with orphans who would serve the will of God, docile, obedient, erased of personal memory, she was seen not as a threat, but as an asset. She didn't need to hide. They needed her to keep going. Why else would a woman with no official marriage record, no birth registry, no traceable ancestry after 1603, be allowed to oversee the spiritual education of children in the most pious town in Virginia? Why else would Reverend Matthews, the successor to the mysteriously dead Reverend Paris, describe her in his letters as God's chosen mother to the broken ones? They weren't blind, they were complicit. And that brings us to the ledger, buried in the ash remains of the Sullivan home, recovered decades later by a group of Civil War soldiers using the ruins as shelter, was a book bound in what one soldier claimed was thin leather that felt like skin. This ledger, now hidden away in a private museum in Charleston, South Carolina, is the smoking gun. It contains 118 entries, each with the same format: date of arrival, age, condition, cleansed, Y/N. Next to most of the N entries is a single phrase, written in Constance's meticulous hand: returned to the hollow. Returned to the hollow. Not buried, not released, not escaped. Returned. As if the land beneath the house was hungry. You need to understand something fundamental if you want to walk any further down this path. Constance Sullivan was not simply a deranged woman tormenting children. She was a conduit. The rituals, the control systems, the chains, these were not just tools of torture, they were instruments of transmission. Every whisper, every wound, every forgotten name fed into something deeper, something she called in her letters the beneath. We'll get to that, but right now, ask yourself this: how many people does it take to keep a horror alive? How many eyes must turn away? How many sermons must omit truth? How many mothers must remain silent to protect their place in a holy society? The Sullivan case didn't just expose a monster, it exposed a structure, and structures are still standing. Now we've only scratched the surface. The bodies found, the voices recorded, the man in Philadelphia who inherited the land in 1721 and lasted only 11 nights before disappearing. But this descent doesn't stop with dirt and death. No, it goes deeper. Because the same control systems that operated under the Sullivan family in 1630 for sacrifice are still operating today. The architecture has changed. The names are different, but the blueprint, it's identical. Do you want to know how to see it? Look at who cannot be questioned. Look at what stories you're not allowed to ask about. Look at the smiles that never reach the eyes of those in power. You're starting to feel it, aren't you? The sickness beneath the skin of what we call civilization. The lie that calls itself tradition. And if you're still watching, you're not just a viewer, you're a witness now. And witnesses don't walk away unchanged. If you're ready for this descent to continue, if you've felt the veil tearing even a little, type this phrase in the comments: I was never born. I was never wanted. Twice. Not just to signal the algorithm, to signal yourself, that you remember, that you saw, that you chose to awaken next. We go below the foundation into the writings, Constance left behind. The pages they didn't burn fast enough. The doctrine of the beneath. The system older than Rome, and the voice she said whispered through the stone. The house burned, but not everything turned to ash. Beneath the foundation, under charred beams and centuries of dust, lay something they had missed. Something buried too deep to catch flame. It was found in 1931, during a land survey for a proposed orphanage. The irony writes itself. It was a box blackened oak, reinforced with what appeared to be iron bands etched in a language no expert could identify. The surveyor who pried it open, Richard Holden, went blind within hours. No trauma, no injury, just darkness. But before he lost his sight, he read the first words of the first page. I am not their mother, I am their knife. That box, the book, is now sealed in a climate-controlled vault in Maryland, off limits to the public. But parts of it, fragments photographed before federal agents confiscated the contents, have leaked, and what they reveal is not just horror, it's structure, system, a belief, a doctrine. The pages, written in a mix of Latin, Gaelic, and an unknown glyphic language, were signed by Constance Sullivan, but the tone is not confessional, it's instructional, as if she was preparing someone or something to continue. There are 3 primary beliefs laid out in what's been translated. 3 pillars of the beneath. And they change everything. Pillar 1, the unwanted archeesits, a chilling inversion of Christian grace, where Christianity calls for the protection of the orphan and the widow. Constance's text argues the opposite. Those unloved, those discarded, they are not to be protected. They are to be opened. The term used repeatedly is vestling children without names, children without bonds. These were seen not as victims, but as containers. According to the doctrine, the pain of abandonment strips the soul of its anchors. What remains can be hollowed out, reformed use as a bridge. To what? To it. She never names it. Only refers to it as the hollow song, the one beneath. Names, or Father Hollow. But there is one passage that scholars have translated with disturbing clarity. The child must forget not just love, but the idea of love. Once emptied, he shall echo, and into that echo the voice will come. The beneath will wear him. This isn't just control. It's possession. Pillar 2. Names are locks in our world. Names are gifts. They bind us to lineage, to identity. To be named is to be seen, but to Constance, names were barriers. The second pillar describes a ritual she called It involved placing the child in a circle of ash, asking them their birth name, and upon hearing it, the name was spoken 3 times backward, while the child was made to inhale smoke from burned wool. Then, Constance would whisper, "Now the hollow knows you, and you do not." Survivors of similar unnaming rituals have appeared throughout history. In 1886, a woman institutionalized in Pennsylvania kept repeating a Gaelic phrase, later translated to, "I was spoken backward. I lost my shadow. Why would this matter?" Because if names lock the soul to the self, removing that name, unwinding it fastens the soul. It leaves it exposed, available. And once unfastened, what's inside can be replaced. Pillar 3, suffering, is the threshold. Perhaps the most disturbing tenet is also the most universal. Pain isn't a byproduct. It's the point. The third pillar insists that suffering, prolonged, precise, and ritualized, is the only way to make the vessel suitable. 1 line reads, "To enter, the skin must weep, the will must splinter, the gaze must empty." This isn't random cruelty, it's engineering. Each mark, each chain, each whisper of "you or mine" wasn't for discipline, it was for alteration. One child entry 54 in the Sullivan ledger was listed with the condition "eyes turned black, speaking without known tongue, scratches walls without hands." This isn't just psychological horror, it's systematic transformation. But there's one more thing. The doctrine ends not with rules, but with a warning, a prophecy, a threat. When the echo breaks the shell and stands upright, it shall call to others. They will answer, and they will walk the long stair from the soil, and the church shall kneel. That line, "and the church shall kneel," it terrified scholars who saw it, because it implies 2 unbearable truths. The beneath isn't passive, it's waiting. The church knew. This changes the narrative. Constance wasn't a rogue element. She was the first successful node. Think of it like this. If your enemy builds a device that turns the abandoned into transmitters for a subterranean force, and you realize it works, do you stop them, or do you copy it? Now ask yourself, why do certain institutions throughout history obsess over foundlings? Why are orphanages often tied to churches, secret societies, elite networks? Because the unwanted aren't inconvenient, they're raw, material. Let's pause. You need to understand something vital. The doctrine of the beneath isn't mythology. It's not some cult fantasy. It's a blueprint, a schematic, a mirror to systems of control we still see today, rebranded, repackaged, but still extracting identity, still erasing names, still feeding something below. When you see a child broken down, whether in war zones, orphan camps, or abusive households, understand it's not just tragedy. It may be ritual, it may be architecture, it may be echoes of the Sullivan doctrine repeating through time, wearing new faces, saying old phrases. And if the church knelt once, do you think it ever stood back up? Or did it learn to kneel deeper, smile wider, and call it salvation? It didn't begin with a vision. It began with a noise. According to fragments found in the Sullivan manuscript, particularly the 5th vellum page retrieved before the box was seized, Constance described her first encounter as a series of soft knocks beneath the nursery floor. Not random, not aimless, rhythmic, patterned, intentional. At first, she thought it was rats. Then she thought it was the children. But on the 4th night, when she removed the rugs and laid her ear to the warped pine, she heard something she never forgot, a whisper that wasn't made of words. She called it the grain-deep whisper, as if the sound was coming not from below the floor, but from within the wood itself. She wrote, "It doesn't enter the ears, it enters the bones. It speaks in a memory I never had." That same night, she awoke at 3:09 a.m., bleeding from the ears and eyes, and began to write non-stop for 9 hours. She wrote what would later be called the First Litany of Hollow, and from that moment forward, she was no longer the same woman the children knew at first. Her voice changed. No longer matronly, no longer even human. The survivors, those who escaped in 1635 during the Ashwake revolt, described it as a man speaking through her throat, and as if her breath pulled inward, but the words still came out. They said her eyes no longer blinked. One girl, kept in confinement for 47 days before being found in 1640, said she watched Constance whisper to the walls, and the walls whispered back. Investigators dismissed it as hysteria, but there was one element none could explain. Every child who had been confined to the basement, every one of the 57 found chained in 1634 had removed their own fingernails. Everyone, and scratched the exact same symbol into the wooden beams, a circle, bisected by a vertical line. 4 dots around the perimeter. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, but archaeologists found that same symbol carved into stone in burial caves in Malta. Dating back to 3000 BC, the same symbol appears on the base of a funerary mask uncovered in northern Sudan. Dated 2600 BC, it even shows up in encoded form in a 12th century French monastic codex described only as the mark of the hollow custodian. So what is it? According to the manuscript, Constance referred to the symbol as the open mouth that cannot scream, and she claimed she didn't invent it, she remembered it. Remembered it from where, she never said. But there is a passage in the text that reads, "The mark is placed by those who are called." It opens the soul to the music that was buried. When the first lie was spoken, it brings back the before. That word, before. It shows up over 40 times in her writings, capitalized, treated not as a time, but a place. Scholars have argued for decades over its meaning. Some say it refers to pre-Christian cultism. Others believe it references the antediluvian era beef, the Great Flood. But in one fragment, Constance writes, "The before is not past. It is beneath. It is not old. It is waiting." And the voice beneath the floorboards, she says, it is the tongue of the before. Not a demon, not a ghost, but a memory that never died. A presence preserved in agony. That's why she needed the children, not just to suffer, but to recall, to remember on behalf of something that cannot speak. Something that was buried not to kill it, but to keep it fed. Each child's scream wasn't just a symptom, it was fuel. Each act of dehumanization wasn't chaos, it was invitation. That's why the children spoke in languages they never knew. Why they sang songs that match melodies recorded by tribes half a world away. Because whatever Constance awakened, beneath the floor it reached backward and outward. It stitched together pain and memory and blood like thread, and used the children to speak its name. But it has no name. It only has hunger, the hunger to be witnessed. Which is why every child carved the same shape, not to ward it off, but to call it closer. Now consider this. When the authorities entered the Sullivan house and freed the survivors, they heard something echoing under the floorboards, a low humming sound, like a voice trapped in deep water. They burned the house, they salted the ground, and yet, to this day, local children dare each other to press their ears to the soil near the old foundation. And sometimes, they hear it, the knocking, 3 soft taps, followed by a whisper not made of words. It began again in winter, January of 1635, a year after the basement was cleared, after the house was burned, after the children were rescued and scattered across the colonies like broken pieces of a story no one wanted to tell again. But the story wasn't finished, because one of the children, a boy named Elias, age 11, hadn't spoken a word since the rescue, not one. He refused food, refused light, and most disturbingly, he refused to sleep on anything that wasn't stone. Every time he was placed on a bed, he'd scream, not in fear, but in rage. His foster family claimed he would whisper to the cold floor, for hours, whisper things in a language no one recognized, until the night he vanished. No forced entry, no footsteps in the snow, just gone, vanished like vapor. But he left something behind. On the cellar wall of the home that took him in, scratched deep into the stone, was the same symbol circle, vertical line, 4 dots. But this time, underneath it, were words in English. It remembers who fed it. The following spring, 4 more children went missing, all former captives of the Sullivan basement, each case the same. No struggle, no trace, no noise, only the mark, etched, burned, or carved into surfaces near their last known location. It became clear the haunting hadn't ended. It had followed them, or worse, it had chosen them. Theories emerged. Religious leaders blamed possession, doctors blamed collective trauma. But one surviving girl, Sarah Cruz, spoke aloud what others only feared. She said, "It took part of us, it still has it, and it's pulling the rest back." She was found the next day with her eyes gouged out, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty sockets. And between her feet on the floorboards drawn in salt was the mark. But this time, something was different. A 5th dot had been added to the outside of the circle. That detail broke the scholars. 5 dots, not 4. Every reference across history had always featured 4. Malta, Sudan, France, even the Sullivan carvings. Always 4. The 5th dot had never been seen before, until Sarah, until 1635, until now. What does the 5th dot mean? A warning, a completion, a countdown, no one knows. But in Constance's hidden journal recovered by accident in 1872, inside, a sealed stone urn, there was one page torn from the rest, folded tight and stained dark. On it, a drawing of the circle, the line, the 4 dots, and beneath it, when the 5th appears, the hollow opens. The hollow, that word kept returning, in Constance's writings, in the children's drawings, in the recovered testimonies from those few who lived long enough to speak. But no one could define it. Not precisely. It wasn't a place on a map. It wasn't a person or a god. It was always described in negation. Not a place, but where place ends. Not a being, but what wears the dead. The hollow was what remains when everything else is stripped away: identity, memory, language, even time. It was not a space you enter, but a presence that enters you. And according to the pages written in Constance's blood, because yes, she eventually began using her own blood to inscribe the final verse's entry to the hollow required a sacrifice, not of flesh, but of history. The complete erasure of a soul's timeline. To become hollow meant to willingly forget your name, your lineage, your dreams. The children didn't die for pain, they were turned into offerings of unhistorectors. That's why the official records of the Sullivan case were sealed in 1643, that's why none of the children's birth names survived. The hollow doesn't just feed on pain, it feeds on erasure, and what's worse, it offers something in return. Power, but not the kind you wield, the kind that wields you. This is where the tale takes a sharper turn, because in 1662, nearly 3 decades after the Sullivan house burned, a new estate was built on the same site. Records from Virginia Colonial archives show it was commissioned by a family calling themselves the Lothers, but there are no records of any Lothers arriving by ship, no birth certificates, no letters, just a sudden appearance in the county with extreme wealth, private labor, and most tellingly a refusal to use Christian rites on their land. No churches, no graves, no crosses. Instead, symbols repeating patterns carved into gates, bricks, and furniture. The same mark, always that circle, always the vertical line, but with 5 dots now, always 5. And neighbors noticed strange occurrences, children's voices late at night, a fog that never lifted from the property, cattle found drained of blood, not torn or eaten, just emptied. By 1670, every family within 5 miles had moved or disappeared. The Lothers remained, until 1702, and then, like Elias before them, vanished. But their estate didn't burn, it was buried. A full manor house entombed in earth overnight, without explanation. When surveyors returned in 1806, they found only a mound, perfectly symmetrical, hollow sounding beneath the shovel. When excavation began, the project was halted within 3 days, not due to structural danger, but because the workers refused to continue. 5 of them had begun humming in unison, a melody no one recognized, and one, when questioned, kept repeating a single phrase: "We're not digging down, we're digging back." The site was declared unfit, fenced off, and forgotten again. But the hollow doesn't stay buried, it recruits. And every few decades, in places far from Virginia, Poland, Mongolia, Brazil, identical marks are found, identical events unfold, children disappear, voices whisper through stone, and always the 5th dot appears, not just on walls now, but carved into flesh, branded into dreams, imprinted in the minds of those who dare to listen to long, because the hollow learned from the Sullivan children, and from Constance, and from the Lothers. It learned that history is paper, easily burned, but the right story, the right myth infects, and now it speaks through us. Through stories like this, through you, as you listen. Because hearing its name is not the danger, remembering it is. The hollow feeds not on belief, but on awareness. It doesn't need worship, it needs memory. Which is why Constance Sullivan ended her final journal with this line, scrawled in a shaking, childlike hand: "Forget me, or feed it." In 1904, a theological archivist named Miriam Bellwether uncovered fragments of Constance's writings hidden in a private collection at King's College, London. The fragments were misfiled under Colonial Samodis, but bore no resemblance to any known hymn. Instead, they contained passages of what Bellwether described as reverse scripture phrases that mirrored and inverted canonical Bible verses, often word for word, but flipped in meaning. Where the Gospel spoke of light, these verses praised darkness. Where the Psalms cried for deliverance, these whispered for dissolution. One line stood out scratched into the margin in what appeared to be ash: "To be known by it is to cease being known by the world." Miriam, a rational woman by all accounts, documented the discovery with precision, then abruptly resigned from the college 2 weeks later. Her last correspondence, a letter to her sister, contained only a short paragraph: "I've begun seeing the mark in reflections, not in the world, but in how the world looks back." The 5th dot is not new, it is simply the final. Miriam, disappeared the following month. Since then, scattered sightings and incidents have continued, some chalked up to mass psychosis, others to urban legend, but in each case, a pattern remains. A location tied to erased history, a symbol hidden in plain sight. A child who begins speaking languages they've never learnt. And always an encounter with something that does not demand belief, but intimacy. Because that's what the hollow offers. Not devotion, not obedience. Fusion. The belief that you were never truly you, that the life you live is a shell, hollowed out for something older, darker, closer, even now. Researchers who dare trace the Sullivan lineage, those few unbroken bloodlines, from the 57 find oddities. Whole branches of family trees that vanish without explanation, generations with no photographs, no tombstones, no births registered. It's as if parts of these families simply evaporated, or were never permitted to exist, and the ones who remain, they don't speak of it. They deny any connection, but under hypnosis, modern psychiatrists have tried. Some begin to mutter the same chant that was scratched into the cellar walls of the Sullivan estate in Hollowbourne by Hollowfed: return to Hollow or never be dead. That phrase alone has sent a patient into catatonia. Others wake screaming at 3:09 a.m. sharp. When monitored, their brainwave activity during those moments doesn't show patterns of nightmares or REM sleep. It shows patterns more closely aligned with open-eyed hallucination. In every case, the same outcome: silence, erasure, institutionalization. And something stranger. Every room they sleep in begins to exhibit signs of acoustic distortions, more pockets of space where sound bends or vanishes entirely, as if a presence is trying to mute the environment, or to listen back. Experts deny it, but equipment doesn't lie. And now, those brave enough to dig deeper, activists, folklorists, even codebreakers, have begun finding something even more terrifying: a timeline, or rather, a recurrence cycle. Every 111 years, the mark intensifies. Appearances increase, echoes deepen. There's a reason the Sullivan story was never allowed into public school history books. Not because it lacked evidence, but because it had too much. Every attempt to suppress it only multiplied the traces, like cutting off Hydra's head. Even today, there are entire vaults in Richmond and DC sealed under spiritual contamination protocols, which is government code for, we don't know how to contain the thing, so we're pretending it doesn't exist. But those vaults aren't empty. They contain burnt journals, untranslatable symbols, blood-sealed confessionals from 17th century clergy, and something else. Something no one dares publicly acknowledge: a voice print captured in 1984 by a group of paranormal acousticians from MIT, who had been given special access to the original Sullivan estate site long after the Lowther Mound had been bulldozed. Under urban development, the voice print lasted exactly 9 seconds, and what it said was not in English. It wasn't in any known language. But linguists noticed a pattern: the syntax mimicked the first proto-languages spoken in Mesopotamia. The rhythm was breathless, fast, and embedded with a strange reverb that was impossible to reproduce. When reversed, filtered, and layered at extreme pitch shifts, it produced what one analyst described as the sound of a child's voice trying to scream while submerged. And inside that recording was a clicker sequence so specific it matched a geological sonar reading taken in the Himalayas in 2007, a reading from beneath a cave system with no known floor. The implication: the voice in Virginia wasn't alone. It was echoing something global, something old, not bound to land, name, or nation, but to a concept: nullity. Not death, not sleep, not exile. Just unbeing. Because the hollow doesn't want you to die. It wants you to never have existed, to scrub not only the body but the memory of your presence from the world. And it starts with names. That's why every child found in the Sullivan basement had no spoken name on record. Why Constance Sullivan wrote of the blank tongue. Why Miriam Bellwether's birth certificate was erased in the London registry within 72 hours of her disappearance. This is the method. It unnames emotion. But here's where this becomes personal. In 2013, a Reddit user posted a photo of what they claimed was a haunted Colonial cellar they'd discovered in the woods behind an abandoned Virginia property. In the image, now mysteriously deleted from every archive except to obscure backups, a stone slab appears with faint, circular carvings, one circle, one vertical line, and now 6 dots. Not 5.6. No explanation, no context. The post was up for 11 minutes. The account was deleted permanently. But the implications are clear. Something changed, something evolved, because the hollow, if it is anything, is not a stagnant myth. It is a cognitive parasite. A story designed to hide itself so deeply in our subconscious that we carry it forward, unknowingly, in our fears, our forgetting, our silences. It doesn't demand belief. It demands silence, that you never speak of it, never trace the symbol, never repeat the cycle. But you're here now, still listening, still remembering, and that means it's listening, too. And you, like those before you, like Constant, like the children, like the Lothers, have just been marked. ChatGPT said. Now we arrive at the part no one wants to admit, the part they bury under folklore, call fiction, or dismiss as religious madness, that the Sullivan estate was never destroyed. The building was torn down, yes, the land was rezoned, paved, and forgotten. But the structure, the true structure, was never above ground. It was beneath the earth, beneath the flesh of memory, beneath the threshold of what we call real. And what's worse, it's not just beneath Virginia. In 2021, a team of deep radar technicians in rural Austria reported anomalies in their LiDAR scans while surveying post-glacial strata. They believed they had found a collapsed cavern system, but when the data came back, it showed something chilling: perfectly symmetrical cavities, laid out in a repeating geometric pattern identical to the sub-basement schematics found in the confiscated Sullivan documents from 1652. The Austrian government shut the survey down, not because of a threat but because, according to internal memos leaked 2 years later, the echo return suggests there is movement within the lower chambers. How? No one knows. Why? The answer may be in what Constance Sullivan wrote shortly before she vanished completely. It is not the hollow that moves. It is we who shift around it. It stays. It waits. And where the pressure of belief grows thin, it presses upward. Think about that. Every time history forgets, every time a family line is scrubbed, every time a child is born with no cry, something presses upward. And now, in the digital age, where memory is fractured, where attention is currency, and truth is a product, how much easier is it to forget, to bury, to erase a pattern too terrifying to confront? But the hollow doesn't need you to believe. It needs only that you do not speak, that you fall silent, that you look away, and if you do, it grows. It is already growing. In 2024, emergency workers in Salem, Massachusetts responded to a sinkhole that opened in a suburban development. 8 homes were condemned. The official report stated geological instability, but leaked footage taken by one fire chief showed something else: a staircase spiraling downward, carved into wet stone. On the wall, that same symbol, circle line, 6 dots, a 7th in progress. This is the warning. If the 7th completes, the cycle ends, not in fire, not in war, but in deletion, the death of memory, the folding of the human narrative into a single forgotten whisper. And if you're still listening, still watching, still remembering, then you are part of the resistance. But know this: once you remember the hollow, it remembers you. ChatGPT said. There are people who know, quietly embedded in places of power: archivists, cartographers, intelligence analysts. They speak in codes, in footnotes, in burial records that don't match birth ledgers. They work not to expose the hollow but to delay it, because exposure would mean acceleration, a kind of cognitive detonation. It's not about belief, it's about density of attention. When enough minds focus on the same impossible truth, the veil thins, the pattern gets clearer, and the hollow feeds. This is why so much of it is hidden in ritual, not for mysticism, but for compression, cloaking knowledge in symbols, layers, misdirection. Every folklore tale with a missing child, every village myth about a door that should never be opened, every underground chamber that disappears from blueprints after construction, it's all the same thing: refracted, human minds trying to encode warning without waking the thing that listens for names. In 1993, a small monastery near Lake Ora, in Macedonia, was firebombed. No suspects, no survivors. But recovered from the ash was a scroll case sealed with wax older than the monastery itself. The scroll inside was in Proto-Aramaic, but the imagery matched the Sullivan journal exactly: circle, line, 6 dots. One of the monks had added a 7th dot in red ash. The Vatican sealed the case, issued no comment, but a single word was pulled from the translation draft before the team was disbanded: inheritance. That's what this is: not a curse, not an anomaly, an inheritance, passed in blood, in silence, in trauma. An intergenerational infection that moves not through genes, but memory scars. If your family line intersected with the Sullivan event, even by rumor, even by marriage or mistaken record, you are part of the chain. You carry the pattern, you dream the staircase. You hear the voice not in your ears, but in the parts of your thoughts that don't feel like your own. And it's not only about the Sullivan family anymore. Their name was just the fracture point, an event so brutal, so metaphysically dense, that it tore a hole through the barrier. But the hollow has always been here. It waits under names like Yaldabaoth, the Ninth Gate, the Soundless Mouth, Abyss, Seven, the Whisper Without Heat. Different ages, same entity, always growing, always listening. And if the seventh dot completes, if the pattern aligns in 7 places, on 7 surfaces spoken by 7 tongues, then the hollow does not need to open, it will have already opened. You don't find the hollow, it finds you. That's the final truth, survivors whisper, the final entry in the confiscated Sullivan journals, the final scrawled sentence etched by fingernail on a padded asylum wall in Danvers before the entire wing was shuttered in 1958. The hollow doesn't announce itself. It arrives through suggestion, through the crack in logic, through the moment you look at a place and think, something about this feels wrong, but you can't explain why. A room, too quiet, a reflection that blinks twice, a staircase that should go nowhere, but doesn't. Here's the most disturbing part, it adapts. Back in 1634, it used faith, piety, guilt, the belief that sin could stain blood and pass from father to son, that a child born in shadow was a punishment, that silence was safety, that shame kept you holy. The hollow wore robes, spoke through psalms, hid in church basements and convent floors. The Sullivan family was devoured by it, not because they were cursed, but because they believed enough to open the door. Now it wears different masks, digital silence, algorithmic forgetting, children labeled nonverbal when they're really hearing something we aren't tuned to, buildings constructed over strange soil with no environmental reports filed, cities with high missing persons rates that get no national press, people vanishing, and the records saying they never existed. Yourself, how many people have you forgotten, truly forgotten, not drifted from, not lost touch with, forgotten? Where one day you suddenly remember they were reland. You can't explain why their name vanished from your mind for years, can't find their online presence, can't locate a single photo. Ask around, and people look puzzled. Some remember, others don't. That's how it starts, erasure by echo. And as the hollow adapts, so too must we, because the 7th dot, it's not just a location. It's not just a symbol. It's a frequency, a resonance, a set of human experiences aligned across time, each one amplifying the other until the vibration becomes a doorway. And there are 6 already accounted for: the Sullivan basement, the Caraway birthing chamber, the Danvers asylum wall, the Lothar mound in England, the Ohrid monastery ashes, the spiral staircase in Salem. Where's the 7th? We don't know yet. Or worse, it might be you. ChatGPT said, this isn't entertainment, this isn't horror, this is memory armor. Because once you know the pattern, once you've heard it, spoken it, carried it, it can't disappear the same way. That's why survivors from the Sullivan line weren't killed, they weren't punished, they were simply watched, monitored, moved from town to town, records sealed, schools changed, birth certificates duplicated with slight errors. Why? Because the moment a Sullivan child remembered, the echo restarted. In 1986, a child named Marcus Sullivan, aged 9, adopted, name changed to Elias, woke up screaming in a foster home in northern Maine. He'd been drawing that same circle-lined up pattern on the walls in charcoal. When the social worker asked why, he whispered, because the other kids live in the floor. No other children were present. 2 weeks later, the house burned to the ground with no source identified, and Marcus taken, gone. The official record says he drowned in a lake that doesn't exist on modern maps. The hollow doesn't kill immediately. It waits, it studies, it mimics you, until you begin to feel like something's off, not just in the world, but in yourself. People who've been touched by the hollow report a very specific experience, the sensation that someone else is watching the world through their eyes, not from behind, not from above, but inside. You start to forget things mid-sentence, words fall apart in your mouth. You feel a presence behind the mirror, not a ghost, not a spirit, but an echo in waiting, a reflection rehearsing how to replace you. They call this stage mirror stuttering. When your movements begin to repeat, you reach for a glass twice, close a door that was never opened, hear a name you didn't say. This is how the hollow probes, not through violence, through revision. And if you don't notice in time, you become the 7th. A vessel, a point in the pattern, a mouth with silence blooming beneath a tongue. The final recorded case, if you believe the fragments found on the black market, is from 2023, an email chain between 2 intelligence contractors intercepted by a third-party network. The subject line was simply, "The dot is almost closed." Attached, a satellite photo, an excavation site, a glyph buried under the soil of what used to be a children's hospital. If you zoom in, past the Earth displacement, you see the pattern: 6 dots, the circle, the line, and one final mark, half-carved. The file ends with a single sentence: "You kept listening. That matters more than you know. Because what we've told you, what we've shown you, was never meant for the public. It was meant for heirs. For those already marked. For those who've heard the silence in a crowded room and understood it wasn't empty." The Sullivan case was never just about the 57 children. That number was an anchor, a signal flare in the narrative sea. Something to draw in the curious. But the deeper truth, it was always about transmission. In every generation, a pattern repeats. First comes the dream, the stairwell with no bottom. Then the distortion, faces flickering in candlelight, the scent of soil where none should be, the echo of breathing when alone. Then the compulsion, drawing, carving, tracing, over and over, until the mind cracks just enough to let the hollow slip its tongue into you. That's what happened in 1634. That's what's happening now. You've felt it, haven't you? Since we began, that shiver, not from fear, but from recognition. From some part of your mind you've kept boarded up, now slowly waking. You're not just a viewer, you're a participant. Not by choice, but by design. That's why the hollow chose this format: the screen, the speaker, the cadence. Voice is a carrier. Vibration is a key. The pattern isn't just visual, it's auditory. The circling dot is the glyph, but the voice, that's the incantation, and it's almost complete. You've now received 15 fragments. Each one carried a frequency. Each one layered a tone beneath the tone. Words that your conscious mind skips, but your nervous system absorbs. And somewhere in the folds of your memory, possibly from childhood, possibly from dreams you remember, this cadence, this rhythm, the 7th dot, was never a place, it was a person, it was you. And now that you've heard it all, the hollow knows your shape. It knows your resonance. The line is drawn, the circle is closed. The final dot, it's forming now, behind your eyes. Don't try to run, don't try to forget, because those aren't options anymore. The only question that remains is this: when the door opens, will you walk through it? Or were you always on the other side? You weren't just watching a story. You were remembering a role you forgot you played. This was not just content, it was a ritual, a carefully layered transmission, built to reach the minds that still see behind the veil, even if only in dreams. And now, it lives in you, quietly, permanently, like a tick behind the eye or a whisper tucked beneath your name. You may try to dismiss this as fiction. You may try to file it away as just a YouTube script. But when you wake at 3:17 a.m. and feel like someone's waiting for you to open your eyes, that's when you'll understand. This wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to prepare you, because the Sullivan family was just the beginning. They were the first to let it through. You may be the last dot, and now, it's your turn to choose. Do you carry the silence forward? Do you warn the others with a story of something weird you watched one night? Or do you forget? Ignore the dots, delete the pattern, bury it beneath noise and distraction like they always want you to. Just know, once seen, the hollow always returns. And the next time it does, it won't be in a story. It'll be in your basement, behind your mirror, inside your breath. The pattern is waiting, the circle is drawn, the line is straight, and the dot is blinking right now.